Ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to another episode of the 80s ADHD Guy with Ben Glenn. That is me. I grew up in the 80s and I have ADHD. Therefore, the 80s ADHD podcast, ADHD 80s Guy podcast. Anyway, this is where I dive into all things ADHD, whether it's from a podcast that I've listened to, things that I've read, things that I've experienced. I have been out speaking for well over 30 years on the subject and grew up with all kinds of different things in the 80s. And I think that the overall goal of this podcast is just to be authentic. That's a great word. Just to kind of navigate different things. When I was working out at the church, my students were always teasing that I am going to be canceled, and this very well may be the thing that cancels me, because I'm not going to perform. I'm not going to pretend like I'm on stage. I feel like I'm having a conversation with you, the listener, and at least that's what's going through my mind as I'm looking at this camera. I'm seeing somebody listening and hopefully getting something out of what I'm saying. And so these first few podcasts are going to be just me. Eventually, I'm hoping to extend it to where I invite guests on. But today, I want to dive into, in this third episode, understanding ADHD. So I went online, and if you're listening to this, you can't see, I've got a couple pages here of things that I printed off that I just want to kind of read for you and then let my mind just go with it. You know, one of the greatest things about being ADHD and being a speaker is that I can tell my clients, hey, if you're dealing with something in your corporation, like a couple of days prior to me getting on stage and talking to your staff, let me know what it is. If it's something that's within my wheelhouse, if it's something that I can kind of grasp, it will come out in the presentation, and hopefully in a positive way. But there is that quick-witted, spur of the moment, maybe tie in that impulsivity type of thinking that just has been a part of my life. And so when I read something, and this is where you get into, okay, well, this is where you could get canceled. So if I'm going to be authentic, if I'm going to just be free and just be myself, not everything that I think initially is appropriate. Not everything that I think is going to be lovey-dovey. It's going to be, well, we don't know yet because I haven't read anything. But that's just the way that my brain is. Now, through the years, I have learned how to control that. I've learned the importance of, hey, think before you speak. Growing up, I did not have that gift. I would say and do things that were horrible. I quickly learned that, hey, just because you think it doesn't mean you should say it. And so in this podcast, I'm going to wipe away those filters. I'm going to let my brain go, because I also think that if you don't have ADD and you're listening to this, it'll give you a little bit more of an insight into how our brains work. I think that a lot of times people that have ADHD, you have the individuals that are younger who haven't figured out how to socially manage some of those impulses and some of those things that make you socially tolerable. Maybe, I don't know if the word is. I don't want to use the word acceptable, but I think that it's quite well known that individuals that have ADHD don't always feel like we fit socially. People look at us like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that, or oh my gosh, I can't believe you did that, or oh my gosh, your energy is like out of control. And so I was listening to this one podcast. It might have been a reel. I think it was a reel. In this woman who has ADHD and autism, so she's got what's called comorbidity, and we'll talk about that. That's one of those big doctor-esque kind of medical words that you're like, that just doesn't sound great. But it means that she's got multiple neurological developmental issues going on at the same time. And she was talking about, you know what? I think she had Tourette's. That was the big one, where she was sharing how, hey, I've got these things, but if you were to meet me in a social situation, you wouldn't know that. And she talked about the incredible emotional labor that she had to to exude or expend, whatever word you want to use there, in order to tamp down some of those socially awkward things, and how at the end of the day she was just absolutely exhausted. And I can relate to that. I mean, back in the day when I started recognizing that, oh, well, this isn't something that people necessarily gravitate towards, or it's irritating, or whatever that may be, just being an observer, I started to recognize, okay, well, let me make this shift here. Let me make this change there. And a lot of that comes through self-awareness. And that is also something that needs to be taught. When you think about an ADD coach and somebody who has ADHD, it is, again, that coach mentorship pouring into relationship where you're giving that coach permission to say, hey, you need to work on a little bit of self-control here and self-awareness. And here's what that looks like. Here's what self-awareness, that's one of those phrases you hear. You're like, self-awareness. So, well, how do I actually do this? How do I actually become aware of the things that I'm doing, especially when you're talking about being impulsive? Wow, that was me going off on a tangent. But again, this is the unabridged Ben Glenn. I'm not going to filter things, and I'm not performing. So let me dive into this. We've only got a 40-minute show. I've tried to keep these at 40 minutes because it's not quite an hour, but it's a little bit longer than 30. Because sometimes you listen to something and you're like, well, I want to get on the treadmill for, 40 minutes. And, well, here you go. You don't even have to set a timer. Just listen to one of my podcasts, and when it's all over, when I say love, peace, and Lego bricks, you can hit that stop button. Okay, so what is ADHD? So I'm going to go ahead and just apologize. If you're listening to this, you probably can't see that I'm actually reading this. And this is a very self-conscious thing. I don't know if I even said that right. My wife is going to listen to this, and she's going to be like, first of all, you need to slow down when you talk. And you might want to just prepare a little bit so that you don't sound like an idiot. But that would totally defeat the purpose of what I'm trying to achieve here. I want you guys to get the raw, the real Ben Glenn. So I am reading this, and a little distraction, ADD tangent here. This was one of my greatest fears growing up, was having the teacher call on me to read something out loud. When an ADD person reads, it's not that they can't read. But sometimes that Ferrari brain with the bicycle brakes that Dr. Hallowell mentions, is in effect here. So you're reading and your brain's constantly, your eyes are jumping ahead and you're looking at the words that are coming up, or you're not necessarily reading punctuations, that you don't necessarily see the commas or the periods. And so it all just kind of rumbles and grumbles together. So I'm going to do my best here because I want to read some of these things and then just give you my take on it and then just see where that all goes. But anyway, let's see. What is ADHD? Talking points. I wrote that down. So here's some facts. We'll dive into this first. ADHD is one of the most common childhood disorders and can continue through adolescence and adulthood. So that is an interesting fact. First of all, it's interesting that they say that this is a fact because as far as I know, scientifically, they haven't really been able to not prove ADHD, because I think that they've done a lot of brain scans and they've seen different things through that, which is kind of a cool advancement. But it's not like you can go into see a doctor and they take your blood and they can process that and see like, oh, he's got high cholesterol, or he is pre-diabetic, or there's not that kind of a test. And so when you think about ADHD, a lot of that comes from observation. I think that this is where I would always lean towards if somebody were to ask me for advice. And again, it is advice. It's opinion. Remember, again, disclaimer, I'm not a doctor. I am not a psychologist. I may be an ADHD coach, but a lot of where I'm going to be coming from is from that experience. What I'm leaning on are my experiences. The 80s were a little bit different than they are now. I think some of those things that we had to deal with back then need to be brought back. and we'll talk about that. But at the end of the day, everything that I'm sharing is my opinion. It's not clinically proven. So if somebody were to come to me and say, hey, I am considering getting tested for ADHD, how do you recommend I go about doing that? Well, you can easily go online and you can take a self-test and answer a bunch of questions, and there's maybe some rudimentary math involved at the end, and if you are between a 1 and a 3 or a 1 and a 5, then oh, ding, 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 guess what? Guess what you win? ADHD. Or you can even go to your regular primary doctor. I've heard of parents going to their, I think it's a pediatrician. They're the ones that work with kids, and they're like, oh, my kid's really hyper, and they're bouncing all over, and they're struggling with homework and focusing, and oh, here's a prescription for Ritalin or Adderall or Concerta or Strattera or whatever, Vyvanse. There's a million of them out there. And oh yeah, we will do a pod on meds. I've got some interesting takes on that. But I would say you got to really consider going to a psychologist. I believe they're the ones. I do, and I'll admit this, I do get confused a little bit with the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist. They sound very similar. I think one of them can prescribe and one of them can't. Or maybe that's a counselor. I don't know. Again, my wife was like, why don't you do the research? You ever heard of Google? Yes, I have. So I would recommend, I believe I went to a psychologist and they did a very in-depth dive into my history. They talked to the people that were around me, and they, through all of that information, were able to come to the conclusion, yes, Ben Glenn has ADHD. Now, I had to get that diagnosis later on as an adult. What got diagnosed early on, back in the 3rd grade, were all the academic issues. Those were the things that got me the 504 designation and the IEP plan and all of those things. But that ADHD thing was not a part of that back in the 80s. In fact, I did not even know anything about ADHD until after I left high school. Now, I know that some of you, if you've listened to my talk, I kind of roll it all together because it's always been there. If you've got the neurological disorder, based on what we just read, this is something that you will always have. I'll have people come up to me and they'll say, well, I was diagnosed ADHD. I grew out of it. For those of you that are listening, that was me drinking a swig of coffee. Coffee is a way that ADD people self-medicate. There you go. No, you don't grow out of it. You don't grow out of ADHD. You figured out ways to accommodate and create structures in order to be productive. Okay? You didn't grow out of it. This is something that is in your brain. Now, there is a thing now. I told you guys in one of the previous pods that I have been working to update my brain with new information, because the great thing is that there are people out there like Dr. Russell Berkeley, Ed Hallowell, John Rady, these doctors, and they're like, hey, we want to continue to learn. And I love that. And they're constantly updating and putting things out there. And one of the things that I read in their book, ADHD 2.0, which I do recommend, I do love this book, one, because I love those authors. But I will say that it felt like if you have ADHD, you have to really, really want that information. It has a little bit more of a medical feel. There's a lot of the letters, like abbreviations and different things. And sometimes when you have ADHD and you start reading through these things, it becomes very difficult to retain that information and to maintain focus. If you, and I'll do a podcast on this, on just the way that Ben Glenn reads. And I read more now than I ever have. I can't say that I love to read, which is really funny because I love to write, which is weird. I think writing, though, for me is like a creative outlet. There's a lot going on inside here, and I got to get it out. And so, but one of the things that they talk about in their book is how there is now this new diagnosis called VAST. And I, for the life of me, cannot retain what the VAST stands for. But I understand the concept behind it is that we now live in a society that creates individuals who have ADHD-like symptoms. They don't have the neurological disorder. They have the symptoms because of this crazy, fast-paced social media, everything at the palm of our hand. I just held up a phone for you guys that are listening to this to give emphasis to the fact that this device is creating ADHD-like symptoms in kids and adults. And so, but they call that vast. And so I think the important thing is that you want to go to somebody like a psychologist who can do the deep dive, because then there's that consideration for medication. You don't want to medicate something if that thing is not a neurological disorder, but rather it is we need to regulate how much social media, how much time you spend on video games, and then also nudging our young people into community. Like, we've got to put them in social situations so that they can develop social skills. So I think that that first fact, ADHD is one of the most common childhood disorders and continues through adolescence and adulthood, is also an important fact, because those of you that didn't get diagnosed in the 80s and now have kids that are going through the testing, and you all of a sudden get that little light bulb of, oh crap, I think I have this too. You probably do. They've done studies, and I've heard it said that ADHD is hereditary, which means if you have ADHD, it's very likely you're going to have a child with ADHD. Which means the way that you teach your child, the way that you understand your child, will be unique. Because the interesting thing about ADHD individuals is that one ADD person can drive another ADD person crazy. How do I know? Because God blessed me with a child who is my clone, and I love her to death, but boy, I tell you what, we can butt heads better than anybody. We also have a lot of fun together. But if I didn't understand ADD and I didn't understand the things that I went through in the way that I do, now that's a big difference. Like if you don't know that you have ADHD and you just developed all these accommodations and structures and different things, and maybe you're a high functioning ADDer and your child is not, you're just like, hey, you just got to suck it up. You got to work hard. You got to find a little bit of discipline, and you're going to create trauma there, because what you're trying to do does not necessarily work with ADHD. The common sense type stuff that we would use with non-ADHD kids don't work with kids with ADHD because of the neurological challenges. So at least that's what I have discovered through my studying and conversation with hundreds of thousands of people on the subject of ADHD. So let's get into the next fact. And by the way, if you're listening to this, I'm hoping, because right now I'm in the beginning stages, my goal here is to record 10 of these and then to launch them. I'm hoping that there is a place where I can open things up for questions, because I'm not going to touch on everything, but this gives me a chance to, maybe do a podcast where it's just Q&A. Maybe we'll do a live thing sometime. That'd be fun. All right. Here's another fact. Symptoms include difficulty staying focused and paying attention, difficulty controlling behavior, and hyperactivity. I think that there's more to that. I think that that's kind of like a very small, those might be the major things, because I would have put impulsivity in here. To me, that's the biggest one, the biggest symptom, and maybe the most detrimental symptom is the being impulsive. How can you not have this in here? I have no idea. And maybe that's the whole difficulty controlling behavior. But when I think of being impulsive, I don't necessarily, when I think of behavior, I don't know, that's a weird visual. I always think about like a little kid misbehaving in the store, having a tantrum. Maybe just the way that I'm reading that, I'm not really connecting with it. But maybe they use this instead of the word impulsive. And when I think impulsive, I think of just bad decisions. But not every time. That's the thing. So sometimes being impulsive can actually be a good thing. in the early 2000s, I decided to get a little bit crazy and creative, and I love comedy. I love humor. I think laughter is an incredible gift from God. I love the fact that the Bible says that God desires us to experience great joy. In fact, I believe there's some translations that use the word abundance, which means just an ample amount of joy. And there is nothing better. Nothing brings more joy than laughter. I mean, you can't laugh and then not at the end of that just be like, well, that felt good. They've done studies. Laughter is healing. That whatever happens chemically, and again, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know, but it has the ability to make people feel so good that there is a healing element to it. Like if you think about like a natural high, that's laughter. If you are somebody who struggles to laugh, you need to find some way to access that funny bone. And there are people, I've met them. They don't usually like me because I'm always cracking jokes and making faces and, saying things and just, witty. I think that I don't think that I was a class clown. I think that because I suppressed that so much back when I was in school, because I didn't want to draw attention to myself and because I was struggling so much with my identity and fitting in and all of those things, I now have kind of leaned into it. I've learned that it can get me in trouble. But all that said is that laughter is just an incredible gift. And so in the early 2000s, I decided, hey, you know what? Let me kind of lean into this and let me do some stand-up comedy. And I started doing clubs and different things, open mic nights, and I'd reach out to some of my comedian friends. And one of my most favorite memories is Ken Kington, who is an incredible Christian comedian. He had developed this program, or it was a pilot for a series that he wanted to pitch for like a comedy thing. And I think they actually did something like this, where you'd get up and they would judge, and it was very much like your American Idol kind of a thing, but with comedy. But it was clean comedy. And that was where the difficulty kind of came in, because it's easy to go, dirty. It's easy to be crass. And I can remember in one comedy club, the manager came up and said, hey, anybody who's new tonight, you are not allowed to use the F word. And I loved that, because most comedians that are kind of new and a little bit crass and dirty, they're going to just drop out, just swear word after swear word after swear word. And the challenge is, hey, no, can you be funny and not have to be dirty? And you think about like comedians like Brian Regan or, what's his name? Jim Gaffigan. I love Jim Gaffigan, who these guys just super clean. Jerry Seinfeld, another very clean comedian. And then you go to the polar opposite with comedians like Dane Cook, who's just like every other word is the F-bomb. But Ken Kington was a good friend of mine, helped me with my speaking career. And he was a comedian. So I called him up and I'm like, hey, I want to give this comedy thing a try. And he invited me down to Atlanta. And I went down there and I had written 15 minutes of material, and I got up in front of Ken Kington, and then there was another guy, Bob Smiley, and then there was this other guy, Tim Hawkins. And at the time, Tim Hawkins was not as big as what Tim Hawkins is now. If you want to watch somebody who's absolutely hilarious, Google Tim Hawkins. And so I got up and I did my 15 minutes, and then afterwards we went out for coffee, and it was the most memorable, most powerful, most exciting coffee I've ever had, because I had Ken Kington, Tim Hawkins, Bob Smiley, three of the best Christian comedians out there, even right now, and they were all giving me advice. They're all giving me like, hey, if you pause here and if you throw a punchline here, and one of them be like, hey, try this, and they were all feeding off each other, and I'm just over there just trying to take notes as quick as I can. And some of the stuff that we came up with was just pure gold. I still use it. 20 years later, it still hits. And so being impulsive and being a comedian actually works. When you're up on stage and somebody heckles you, or something, the microphone doesn't work or something just doesn't go right. If you have ADHD, you can easily lean on your ability to be impulsive and to think quick, to think on your feet. I don't know where that phrase came from, but It's like we only think when we're sitting down, but no, think on your feet. And so I don't want to completely bag on being impulsive, but that is one of the symptoms. And the difficulty of staying focused, yeah, that's a real deal. I can't say anything against that. I think that that is a very true thing. When you've got this race car brain, you think, if you think about like your eyes are focusing forward, and let's say you've got a circle that is rotating in front of you, and every time that circle comes into your view is what you're focusing in on, and it's constantly changing. That's one way to look at it. The other thing is that you've just got a million things competing for your attention. And then if you think, let me give you just even my take a little bit on ADHD, because I think that what's frustrating and what is really challenging for parents, even teachers, is that, wait, so you're saying that ADHD means they have a hard time staying focused and paying attention, and there's the whole behavior thing and the hyperactivity. But if I take this child and I stick him in front of a video game, all of those things go away. Or if I take this child and I put them in front of a pile of Lego, well, they're not struggling with their behavior. They're not even hyper. They're focused, they're paying attention, they're building, they're playing, they're doing something. And so that then leads to the question of, well, does ADHD truly exist? And it does. There's no debate. They've done just an incredible amount of study. There was actually at one point people that are like, well, this is just something the pharmaceutical companies made up to sell their drugs. Well, that's not true. And this has actually been around for a long time. It has evolved. I mean, before it became ADHD, it was ADD. They had ADD and ADHD, and then they just went to the ADHD, and maybe to simplify it. And I believe that even before that, they used to call it minimal brain dysfunction. So I'm kind of glad they changed it to some letters. I'd hate to be doing this podcast saying, hey, it's Ben Glenn, the 80s brain dysfunctional guy. So what's the big difference between that kid that can't stay focused and pay attention and being impulsive and hyperactivity versus, hey, when they're sitting in front of something that is engaging and interesting to them, why can they do that? Does the ADD just disappear? Does it go bye-bye? And that's where you get into, wait, this is a neurological thing. We're talking about neural pathways. So if you're listening to this, I'm going to do something with my brain. So like you've got, let's say all the focusing stuff is in the very front of your brain, and then you've got all these wires that are going back and forth. Let's say actual wires. Think about wires. If you were to take some of those wires and you were to take some of that plastic coating off and they were to touch each other, well, what you're going to have is you're going to short out, And so the way that I heard somebody describe it is like, yeah, well, ADHD individuals have, wires that have very little coating on them. So things are constantly shorting out. But when you're doing something that is engaging and that it is something that you're interested in, for some reason, it has no effect. There's not that crossing of the wires. It's almost like it creates that coating or it strengthens those neural pathways so that you can actually focus. And then there's this whole thing with dopamine and that feel-good chemical and all of those things. And they actually do a really good job talking about some of those differences in that ADHD 2.0 book. A little complicated, the science behind all of it. But at the end of the day, the big key factor is this, and this is the way I used to describe it. When an ADHD person walks into a room, they look a lot like a bobblehead. You hit the little bobblehead and the head's all over the place and it's just scanning the room. So imagine a student walking into a classroom and they're literally scanning that room. And while they are, what's the purpose behind scanning the room? It is to find something to focus on. It is to find the most interesting, the most shiny, the most captivating thing in that room. Because ultimately, individuals that have ADHD really do want to focus. So let me say that again. We absolutely want to focus. And when we find that thing to focus on, We are in our best place. We are where we want to be. Until we find that focus, we're going to continue to look hyperactive. We're going to continue to look like we can't stay focused, and we're going to look like we're not paying attention. The reality of it is that sometimes, most times, maybe all the times, the teacher isn't the shiniest thing going on in the classroom. Sometimes it's something going on outside the window. Sometimes it's, your kid, your classmate sitting next to you is eating paste. That's pretty darn interesting. And maybe that young person never finds anything. And so what they do is they go back into the recesses of their brain and they find that entertainment, that shiny, that interesting thing internally. And that's where you get that inattentive type of ADHD. And that's why education is so hard now, because now you have a classroom with not just ADHD, neurologically disabled students, but you also have students that are now affected because of the society we live in with this thing called VAST. So you have got to stand up in front of a classroom, a talking head, and try to compete with all of the entertainment and all of the things that are competing for a young person's attention. And so ultimately, teachers have to be entertainers. They have to figure out a way to be interesting. They have to figure out a way to be engaging. It can't be this boring, person up front regurgitating curriculum, because they're not going to get it. And so when you start peeling back the layers, what we've just done is we've unlocked Pandora's box. I don't even really know much about Pandora's box other than I know that you're not supposed to unlock it. I think there's a horror film out there about it. Don't unlock it. Or, if you want a different visual, it's like the domino effect. You hit that one domino, and if you did it right, and I love dominoes when you stack them up. If you hit that one, they all go. You start realizing, well, we are going to have to teach our teachers differently. We're going to have to equip them differently if we are going to continue to evolve in the way that we are as a society with the technology that we keep coming out with. Well, how are we going to educate our educators to stay up to date with competing with those things that are so shiny, so interesting? So it's a difficult task. It really is. So those are some facts. Let me move on. We got a couple more minutes here. Like I said, I want to stick to my 40. Definition of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So, obviously you know that that's what it means. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. You ever stop and pause for a moment and really think about what those words mean? Attention. So that means, what I'm focusing on. Deficit, which means that there's a deficiency there, which is really interesting because then you hear the word hyperactivity. So if I'm deficient in my attention, but then I'm hyper, it's just kind of a weird mixture. And I know that there are people out there that are saying, hey, we need to even change this diagnosis, the name of it, because it still doesn't quite do it justice. But here's the way they define it. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. I've heard of people say it's a neurological disorder. So now they're saying it's a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by a consistent pattern of there you go, reading out loud. Oh my gosh. Inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity, there's the impulsive word, that interferes with functioning of development. So, okay. I don't know about you, but I read something like that. If I have ADD, I'm more confused. I have no idea what that means. Now I live with it, so it makes a little bit more sense, but there's a few things that jump out to me. So let's dive into this again. This is what I would do with my students when we run into something where I'm like, I don't really understand it. Okay, let's break it down. ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. Well, let's stop there for a minute. So we're talking about something that has to do with our brain. Then you hear the word disorder, which means something's not banging on all cylinders. It means that it's not the norm. Okay. It's interesting I say that, but it also starts feeling like it is becoming the norm. Characterized by a consistent pattern. So let's pause there for a moment and just touch on the word consistent. You ever have a bunch of sugar? Like you ever down a bunch of Fruit Loops, or maybe at Halloween, you just kind of pound that bag of candy, and then you hit that hyper high, that sugar high, hyper high. That's kind of funny. Hyper high. It's like more hyper than, possible. And so you, as a result of the intake of sugar, or maybe even caffeine, you ever seen somebody who has had too much caffeine? It reminds me of the Seinfeld episode where Kramer got a life supply of cafe lattes. He won some kind of a trial thing where he was burned, and he got all the cafe lattes he wanted. And then there was a scene at the very end. It was like he's talking a mile a minute. He's just I can come in here and have a cafe latte whenever I want. I got it right here. I got a lawyer. Give me my cafe latte. Clearly caffeine. So if you've ever had too much caffeine, so there are times where you may resemble somebody who has ADHD, but it's not consistent. It was because you had the sugar, you had the caffeine, is because of something else. So it's that consistent pattern of inattention. It's that consistent pattern of being hyperactive and impulsive that interferes with the functioning of development. I think that in addition to that, it is also, it inhibits your ability to be productive. It inhibits your ability to accomplish simple goals and tasks. If you think about academically, like I'm not able to stay up with the rest of the class because of this. And so I think that, again, why I would recommend somebody go to a psychologist versus just a regular practitioner is that they will dive into, hey, is this a consistent thing? Or did this kid just one weekend have way too much sugar and caffeine together? Did this kid come across a couple cans of Red Bull, and then all of a sudden, bam, shazam, and mom and dad are freaking out, and they're like, you know what, let's just throw some medication at him. No, it's got to be a consistent thing, and that is an interesting part of this whole equation. So you may be somebody who is high functioning and never gets a diagnosis because the academic side of it, because of the social side of it, none of those things pop up at such a severity where somebody's just like, well, maybe this is something we need to get checked out. The interesting thing, though, too, is that even if you are high functioning, there are a lot of other little ADD things that you probably need to be aware of. So if you've got a kid who has ADHD and you're considering the fact that you might also have ADHD, I'm not necessarily saying, hey, go spend the money and get tested. But if you have that thought of, oh, wait, I might have this. So there's nothing wrong with doing a little bit of research. There's nothing wrong with listening to this podcast and saying, hey, let me try this. This is something that Ben recommends. So let me give it a shot and see if it helps with some of these other issues that I am experiencing. Next thing it says is symptoms must be present for at least 6 months. So again, we get back into the consistency. To a degree that is inconsistent with developmental level and that negatively impacts directly on social and academic, occupational activities. I like how they actually put in their academic/occupational activities, because there are some of you that these things don't really come up until later on when you're out there in the workplace, or even beyond that, in a relationship. So we'll put a pin in it here, and we'll pick up in the next podcast, because I'm looking at my timer here, and it literally is 39 minutes and 34, 35, 36. Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this. Like I said, we're going to dive into a bunch of different things. It's going to be all over the place, and I hope you enjoy it. I really do. Everybody says this that puts out a podcast. If you are enjoying this, please hit that follow button. Please leave comments and questions and all of those things. All of that stuff does really inspire individuals that are trying to put out information like this to continue to do that. I won't lie. Back in the day, I was trying to do more videos and different things, and I kind of lost steam because I was getting caught up with the numbers and some of those comments and different things that just weren't coming in. And, everybody wants to go viral. And as I've gotten older, that has no longer become my main focus. My hope really is that those individuals that do listen to this just are impacted in a positive way, that I can help in some way with your ADHD journey, whether you are a parent, a teacher, somebody who, is an adult who's just trying to navigate it. And so really, do leave those questions and give me that follow, because it does help. And we're like, you guys, if you have ADHD, probably one of the biggest issues we run into is, hey, we all start really good. We start out fast and then we peter out. And I am bound and determined to be consistent here. That's the key. You've got to be consistent. And so I am going to work my darndest at doing that. And any encouragement you guys can give on that end will only inspire me to keep moving forward. All right, guys, I hope you have an amazing day. Podcast number 4 coming up next. This is Ben Glenn. And as always, love, peace, and of course, yes, my favorite, Lego bricks. God bless.